to our presenter for this session, Dr. Sasha Turner. Dr. Turner is Associate Professor of History at the Quinnipiac University and co-president of the Coordinating Council for Women in History. She serves as senior editor for Black Perspectives, the award-winning blog of the African American Intellectual History Society. She is also the author of the multi-award-winning book, Contested Bodies, Pregnancy, Child Rearing, and Slavery in Jamaica. I now invite Dr. Turner to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by saying thank you very much to Dr. Heather Cato and her team of supporters and sponsors, including CARICOM Reparations Commission and the Center for Reparations and Research and the Faculty of Humanities and Education. Of course, I'm very excited to be here, if only to escape the cold in North America. Just yesterday, as I was exiting, there was a freeze headed for my home state, my adopted home state. So thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. I also want to start on the point where Erica Williams-Connell ended her reflections earlier today. Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And I start here because I think it echoes another quote that we have in the program that Eric Williams made 75 years ago, which is, "The West Indian historian of the future has a crucial role to play in the education of West Indian people in their own history and in the merciless exposure of the shams, the inconsistencies, and the prejudices of metropolitan historians." When Williams wrote this statement 75 years ago, he anticipated the British Treasury's February 9, 2015 tweet, which erroneously claimed that Britain spent £20 million to buy freedom for all slaves in the empire. The sum of money was so large, the tweet claimed, it wasn't paid off until 2015, which means that living British citizens helped pay to end the slave trade. We can say Williams anticipated the tweet because it gets to the heart of Britain's continued amnesia about her role in slavery and the slave trade, and how Britain leverages her role in abolition as capital. This self-congratulation is what the historian Christopher L. Brown calls moral capital. That the immorality of slavery and the slave trade were beyond dispute, those in favor of abolition, Britain, have been able to claim their position on abolition as a powerful tool or capital to justify national actions and shape their nation's image. Abolitionism has provided Britain with opportunities to claim a national identity as one committed to freedom. This commitment effectively overshadowed and in some cases erased Britain's role in slavery and the slave trade. Troublesome as British amnesia has been, this narrative shows the power of history and illustrates the crucial importance of Caribbean people writing their own histories. Otherwise, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Williams and his work are simultaneously anticipatory of the 2015 moment and a remedy to that moment. Capitalism and slavery disrupted the fiction of the British as liberators. In showing that the reasons for abolition were economic and not humanitarian, Williams opened the gate for future historians to distinguish between the environment in which abolition took place and abolition decision-making. What this means is that there's a difference between the moral campaigns against slavery, in which individual and personal conviction that slavery was immoral compelled many people, including women and Black people, often left out of those self-congratulatory narratives, to sign petitions and boycott goods produced by enslaved people. But it is a mistake to assume that British policymakers shared the same moral convictions of campaigners and that this morality drove them toward the decision of emancipation. The legacy of Williams's work is not just in the specific arguments made, but crucially, it is also in its insistence that we distinguish between emancipation as policy formulation and abolitionism as a social movement, as the historian Thomas Holt framed it. Abolition as policymaking promised to end the slave trade and gradually and very belatedly slavery, while retaining important parts, including the plantation economy, white supremacy, and white heteropatriarchy within the context of British imperial control. Although the social relations of labor would change from slave to wage labor, the race and gender hierarchy that defined slavery would be revised and strengthened. Abolitionists proposed shifting dependence on the slave trade by relying on biological reproduction to replenish declining laboring populations and social reproduction to engineer a subservient black laboring class. To encourage reproduction, abolitionists proposed importing more young and female Africans and ameliorating the condition of women. They proposed removing women from the sugarcane fields and factories and placing them in the home, where they would become wives, mothers, and homemakers. Men, of course, would become breadwinners and participate in limited roles in public life of the colonies. Introducing these separate spheres, women in the home, men in public, anchored by Christian conversion and Christian marriages, would secure the cultural reconditioning abolitionists thought necessary to replace an African or Afro-Caribbean identity with a British one, or Anglicization. Anglicizing black people, or getting them to think of themselves more as British, would create a more stable colony and resolve the problems created by slavery, such as rebellions, which were costly for imperial defense. Williams' insistence on examining abolition policy making rather than abolition as social movement, hedged on moral outrage against slavery's inhumanity, exposes the economics of abolition while inviting investigations into the complex unfolding of abolition. Abolition was more complicated than simply executing the humanitarian fervor of the age. Williams's Capitalism and Slavery has been vital in exposing this fallacy and marks another phase in what we may call critical knowledge projects that challenge imperial narratives bent on glorifying the hunter. The enslaved people themselves were first to see abolition for what it was and what it was not. Among such enslaved people was one enslaved woman named Bessie Chambers, who through her engagement with the colonial justice system or injustice system, exposed the limits of abolition. In addition to counteracting the erasure of enslaved people as the original freedom fighters, Chambers' story will also make clear that enslaved people's vision of freedom starkly contrasted with those held by abolitionists. Understanding such differential visions is vital for us to further apprehend the ways in which abolition reform policy sought to reproduce the social relations of slavery even as it abolished its more coercive elements. We come to understand such visions through the activism of enslaved women like Bessie Chambers, who along with her community understood developments in the metropole and used such developments to further their ongoing struggles to gain freedom and define freedom on their own terms. Chambers, along with 24 unnamed enslaved men and women, filed a complaint in St. George's Slave Court, Jamaica, on June 6, 1823. Chambers charged that the overseer forced her to work despite her pregnancy and that she miscarried because of the hard and unlawful labor he forced her to perform. When Bessie Chambers brought her case to the St. George's Slave Court, the British House of Commons, pressured by abolitionists, had recently passed a series of resolutions imploring colonial assemblies to accord enslaved women protections befitting the supposed fragility of their sex. Women should be protected from field work, the lash, and the exposure of their naked bodies. Abolitionists thought these improvements were necessary to restore the decency and morality of enslaved women. They were important initial steps toward freedom when freed women would occupy their supposed rightful place in the home as wives, mothers, and homemakers. But from Chambers' lawsuit, we know she was aware of legislative changes in Jamaica that now offered enslaved women legal protection from hard labor during pregnancy. More broadly, Chambers understood the change in political context in which she continued to be enslaved. She levied such understandings in pursuing a legal case against her overseer. Abolitionists who relied on stories like Chambers to build their case for abolition, however, denied such agency to the enslaved. Enslaved people like Chambers were reduced to objects of enslavers' misuse and objects of British sympathies. We might know their name and where they were enslaved, but nothing of where they were really from, who their people were, or how they saw themselves. We're told nothing of their histories, their consciousness, or their visions of freedom. In abolitionist case files, women like Bessie were reduced to battered and bloodied bodies, disconnected from kin and community, without agency, and unable to advocate for themselves. To rethink abolitionist history and continue Williams's legacy of decolonizing Caribbean history, we must center the enslaved. In addition to being on the front lines in the battle for freedom, Chambers, like so many other enslaved people, were thinking people, they strategized freedom claims in accordance with changing politics in the metropole and colonies, which they came to understand through their local knowledge networks. Enslaved people's mobility as higglers, sailors, and runaways, along with their self-taught reading ability that enabled them to read colonial and metropolitan newspapers, made them fully aware of abolitionist arguments, as well as a change in laws that now facilitated Chambers pursuing her grievance in the St. George's Slave Court. They took this knowledge and combined it with their knowledge and experiences, which had taught them to fight for freedom and define liberty on their own terms. In their reform proposals that opened up the colonial judiciary system to Chambers, abolitionists did not envision women as public actors. Slavery reform should facilitate women taking their proper place in the home as wives, homemakers, and mothers, liberating men as breadwinners, heads of household, and limited roles as public actors. Chambers, in her court case, challenged abolitionists' limited visions of freedom. She challenged abolitionists who insisted on speaking on behalf of the enslaved. She brought her case to the magistrate and insisted on her role as a public litigant, woman or not. By taking her case to court and speaking up for herself, Chambers rejected the world abolitionists sought to create, in which women would be silenced and would have no public role while men acted publicly on their behalf. Chambers understood the power of colonial courts and the dangers of not having legal standing. From rulings sanctioning the separation of families and denying Black women and girls protection against rape and sexual assault, to legislations prohibiting slaves from testifying in court, Chambers understood how the colonial legal system constrained her life and that of her children and members of her community. Presenting herself and her case to the court, Chambers asserted a right to legal personhood and legal protection for herself and her family, and that enforcing such rights was essential to freedom. By bearing witness to her own suffering and seeking judicial redress, Chambers also countered British parliamentary proceedings that investigated abolitionist claims of inhumanity of the slaving system. These proceedings did not include enslaved people, the people who could best attest to the horrors of slavery. Instead, Parliament primarily relied on the testimony of enslavers who refused to admit their own culpability and justified their brutality or blamed the victim. Ignored by Parliament's investigative committees, Chambers insisted on having her day in court by presenting herself to the local magistrate and voicing her complaints to him. To shift the narrative of abolitionism away from white benevolence on behalf of victimized Blacks, we must center cases like Chambers, who directly confronted her enslaver in court, leaving a record for us to bear witness to her pain and loss as well as her challenge. When abolitionists offered testimony of enslavers' cruelty, enslaved victims appeared without kin or community who could intervene on their behalf or collectively challenge their enslavers' authority. To challenge this narrative, we must look to rebellions and collective acts of resistance mounted by enslaved people and the community networks that sustained and made such acts possible. Enslaved people's social life and community were both counterpoint to slavery and integral to enslaved people's struggle to define the terms and conditions of freedom. 24 men and women accompanied Chambers to court that day. This show of support reveals Chambers' connection to her community and the strategic role that the community played in enslaved people's dealing with the justice system of their enslavers. This show of support was also embodied in the female witnesses accompanying Chambers. They could corroborate Chambers' claims of pregnancy and miscarriage because they would have participated in ceremonial rites marking the beginning and end of life. From sacred rituals performed by female spiritual leaders during pregnancy to the physical assistance fellow women gave mothers during delivery, childbirth was built around a community of women. Among the women present at court that day with Chambers, a few may have been birth assistants and healers who could attest to her pregnancy and subsequent miscarriage. In addition to their knowledge, these women would have commanded social autonomy and significant authority within their community. Birth attendants performed important roles in protecting the physical and spiritual health of mothers and children. Community members revered and regarded them highly. The authority childbearing women, their attendants, and healers possessed within their community emboldened them to pursue their grievances. Women's female networks extended their support beyond the birthing chambers, encompassing the magistrates' chambers. Although the immediate factors that brought Bessie Chambers to court in 1823 were a combination of abolitionist activism and reform, we must be careful not to assume abolitionist reform alone determined Chambers' presence in court that day. Crucially, Chambers' story reflects a longer history of the social institutions and networks enslaved people created and their malleability in the face of political and social transformations. One of the most damaging stereotypes to emerge from slavery is that of the Black matriarch and the disempowered male. In reality, enslaved people's social relationships and household varied. But the most visible family ties in the plantation records were mother-child because enslavers profited from biological reproduction. Abolitionists imbibed such stereotypes, admonishing female-headed households and insisting on reforms to put women in their supposed rightful places, subordination to males. In reality, however, enslaved people's households were more complex. Their arrangements were needs-based, and they reflected the harsh demographic realities of slavery. Enslaved people constructed families across several properties, and slave family ties superseded bloodlines. Rampant family separation and premature death required that enslaved people form partnerships and parent children beyond the confines of their plantation residence or blood ties. Kinship and community, rather than strict family types or blood relations, were the more crucial defining features of enslaved people's familial institutions. Social instability demanded fluid gender roles and family formation. We must view Chambers' court case against enslaved people's nimbleness. Imagine then how Chambers heard abolitionist gendered rhetoric that defined men as public actors, and how she might have thought it necessary to include men as possible litigants on her behalf. The men may have accompanied Chambers not simply to lend moral support, but if needs be, as litigants as well. If the magistrate rejected hearing from Chambers on account of British Gender Convention that denied women public roles, enslaved men would have been readily available to pursue the case on Chambers' behalf. The oppression enslaved women face must be understood as multivariant, and women's fight had to be flexible and strategic. At times, women banded together with men, and at other times they formed single-sex cohorts. Even if within the community of enslaved people, men and women's roles were complementary, the plantation system imposed a hierarchical system which elevated enslaved men over women. Men held leadership roles and highly valued skilled occupation, while women were relegated to undervalued, unskilled, or semi-skilled position. Enslaved women's reproductive labor roles and their vulnerability to sexual abuse distinguished their lives from men, requiring them to mobilize without men. Most prominently, enslaved women's reliance on a community of women to secure abortion, infanticide, and fertility control, which historians theorize as gynecological resistance, demarcate the gendered lines of women's resistance to sexual and reproductive exploitation. Chambers' strategic decision to include men and women is crucial to understanding enslaved people's exercise of agency, and this was not tied to a single strategy. Enslaved women's choices were complicated by the competing gender conventions that defined and structured their lives. By seeking the judgment and protection of the law, Chambers' case illustrates how finely in tuned enslaved people were to the changing political economy of slavery, their conceptualization of rights, legal consciousness, gender hierarchy, and claims to legal personhood. Abolition reforms created important openings for enslaved people's freedom claims, and yet the visions enslaved people like Chambers held of freedom and the afterlife of slavery did not align with abolitionist vision. Bessie Chambers' court presence was at odds with the separate sphere society abolitionists proposed. In addition to offering important insights into the consciousness of the enslaved, how they perceived their freedom and their rights, their gendering and how to secure them, Chambers also reveals the shortcomings of British abolitionism. Abolition was not simply a humanitarian project in Black freedom and equality, it was an experiment in imperial policymaking. To continue Williams's work of devaluing the capital Britain seeks to extract from abolition, we must put abolition under the spotlight and center stories like Chambers and her community of supporters who expose the limited visions abolitionists had of freedom. Thank you.